In 1963, a single lie brought down the entire British government. When Secretary of State for War John Profumo stood before Parliament to deny an affair with young model Christine Keeler, he single-handedly ignited the most explosive political and sex scandal in the nation's history. The entanglement between a senior cabinet minister, a 19-year-old girl, and a Soviet intelligence officer was far more than a private indiscretion. It was a devastating national security breach that permanently shattered the hypocritical facade of the ruling elite. Early 1960s, Britain existed as a society fractured between two completely different eras, held together by a fragile tension. On one side stood the old establishment, a world characterized by rigid class hierarchies, strict public morality, and political power concentrated firmly within the aristocracy and wealthy elites. The conservative values of the post-war era still dominated the halls of Westminster and the country estates of the wealthy. The press largely respected an unwritten rule to shield the private lives of public figures from scrutiny. Politicians were expected to project an image of absolute moral authority, and the public generally accepted this polished facade as reality. On the other side, a new generation was rapidly emerging from the austerity of the previous decade. This younger demographic was defined by shifting cultural norms, the early stirrings of sexual liberation, a vibrant nightlife, and a growing skepticism toward the traditional ruling class. They were no longer willing to blindly accept the narratives handed down by the elite. London was slowly transforming into a hub of fashion, music, and social mobility, where the working-class youth could occasionally brush shoulders with the aristocracy in newly established clubs and cafes. The Profumo Affair ignited at the exact intersection where these two incompatible worlds collided. The historical weight of this scandal lies in its role as a profound cultural catalyst. It marked the definitive moment when the British public stopped assuming that men in high office lived up to the virtuous images they projected. The unwritten social contract of deference was broken. The scandal exposed a profound hypocrisy at the heart of the establishment, revealing that those who dictated the moral standards of the country were engaging in reckless behavior behind closed doors. John Dennis Profumo was born in 1915 into a family of significant wealth and established social standing. His father was a prominent barrister and diplomat with the title of Baron in the nobility of the Kingdom of Sardinia, a title the family chose not to use in Britain. Profumo received an elite education, attending Harrow School and Oxford University, environments specifically designed to prepare young men for leadership roles in the British Empire. He moved seamlessly through the institutions of power, cultivating the connections and the polished demeanor expected of his class. He entered politics at a remarkably young age, becoming the Member of Parliament for Kettering in 1940. At the time of his election, he was the youngest member of the House of Commons. During the Second World War, he served with distinction in the military. He saw intense action in North Africa, Italy, and Normandy, eventually reaching the rank of brigadier. His military record was impeccable, earning him the Order of the British Empire. Profumo built the profile of the ideal conservative politician. He was highly educated, exceptionally well-connected, and possessed the exact blend of military experience and political loyalty required to reach the upper echelons of government. By 1960, Prime Minister Harold Macmillan appointed Profumo as Secretary of State for War. In this highly sensitive role, Profumo held direct political responsibility for the British Army during some of the most volatile years of the Cold War. He was privy to classified military information, troop deployments, and strategic planning at a time when tensions with the Soviet Union were constantly threatening to escalate into open conflict. Profumo had everything to lose. He held a prestigious cabinet position, a promising political trajectory that many believed could lead to higher office, and he was married to the famous and widely respected actress Valerie Hobson. On the surface, he embodied the flawless image of the British ruling class. He appeared successful, responsible, and implicitly trustworthy. His life was heavily insulated by wealth and privilege, operating within a social sphere that firmly believed it was immune to standard consequences. Christine Keeler navigated a drastically different reality, born into circumstances that offered no insulation and very few opportunities. Born in 1942, she was raised in a difficult and impoverished environment in Wraysbury, a village outside London. She grew up in 2 converted railway carriages, facing immense financial hardship, domestic instability, and a severe lack of basic amenities. Seeking an escape from rural poverty and a turbulent home life, she arrived in London as a teenager seeking work and a way to survive. She initially found employment in dress shops and restaurants, standard low-paying jobs available to young women of her background. However, her striking physical beauty soon allowed her to become absorbed into the vibrant and lucrative nightlife of the city. Keeler eventually found work as a showgirl at Murray Cabaret Club in Soho. This specific club served as a frequent and discreet gathering place for wealthy businessmen, senior politicians, artists, and foreign diplomats. It was a place where powerful men went to relax away from the public eye. Keeler possessed remarkable looks but absolutely none of the political power, financial independence, or institutional protection enjoyed by the older men who surrounded her in these establishments. History and the tabloid press frequently reduce Keeler to a crude caricature, painting her as a calculating, malicious woman who deliberately plotted to bring down a conservative government. This narrative fundamentally misrepresents the extreme power dynamics at play. Keeler was barely 19 years old when she first encountered the Secretary of State for War. She was operating within a world engineered, funded, and controlled by older, wealthy, politically connected men. Labeling her merely as a high-class call girl or a manipulative spy makes the complex story much easier to sell to the public, but it completely obscures the reality of a young woman caught in machinery far beyond her control. She was a vulnerable participant in a social ecosystem designed specifically to exploit youth and beauty for the entertainment of the elite class. Her survival depended on navigating the desires of men who held all the economic and social cards. Stephen Ward was the central architect of this specific social ecosystem. He was a highly skilled osteopath who maintained a lucrative practice in London. His medical clients included Winston Churchill, Ava Gardner, Frank Sinatra, and numerous members of the British aristocracy. However, medical treatment was only a fraction of his true occupation and influence. Ward functioned as a supreme social connector, a man obsessed with proximity to power and fame. His social circles were incredibly diverse, including aristocrats, members of parliament, renowned artists, foreign diplomats, and young women seeking entry into high society. Ward possessed a unique and dangerous ability to cross rigid class boundaries that usually kept these groups strictly separated. He hosted lavish parties and maintained residences that served as neutral ground, where these strictly segregated demographics could freely mingle without fear of judgment or public exposure. Through Ward, Christine Keeler gained direct access to the upper class. He provided her with housing, moving her into his own residence, and introduced her to a constant stream of powerful men. He acted as a mentor, a landlord, and a social guide, though his motives were constantly blurred. It was through Ward that John Profumo would eventually meet Keeler. Crucially, it was also through Ward that Yevgeny Ivanov entered this exact same social orbit. Ward was not merely a party host or a society doctor. He was the structural bridge linking the highest levels of the British government, the London underworld, and foreign intelligence networks. This specific network transformed what would have been a standard political affair into a grave security threat. The collision of these individuals was not an accident, but the direct result of Ward meticulously cultivating a circle where immense power and extreme vulnerability constantly intersected. He thrived on the danger and the prestige of knowing everyone's secrets, unaware that this same network would eventually cause his total destruction. Yevgeny Ivanov operated officially as the naval attaché at the Soviet embassy in London. To the casual observer moving through the upper echelons of British society, he was a charming, highly sociable diplomat who enjoyed bridge, strong liquor, and engaging conversation. He possessed a rugged charisma that allowed him to effortlessly integrate into the exclusive gatherings of the British elite. However, the British intelligence services, particularly MI5, did not view him as a standard diplomatic envoy. They heavily suspected, with profound justification, that Ivanov was an active and highly capable intelligence officer working for the GRU, the Foreign Military Intelligence Agency of the Soviet Armed Forces. During the early 1960s, the Cold War was reaching a peak of silent, paralyzing tension. The ideological battle between the East and the West was not fought on traditional battlefields, but in drawing rooms, embassy receptions, and the shadowed corners of capital cities. In this environment, a military attaché like Ivanov carried multiple, highly classified responsibilities. His primary mission was not diplomatic pleasantries. He was tasked with gathering raw intelligence on British military capabilities, assessing potential targets within the government, and constantly probing for weaknesses among host country officials. He was a professional trained to identify vulnerabilities, whether they were financial, ideological, or deeply personal. A critical and often misunderstood paradox exists within the historical record regarding Stephen Ward and his relationship with Ivanov. British intelligence was acutely aware of the Soviet agent and his growing association with the well-connected osteopath. Instead of immediately shutting down the contact, MI5 reportedly considered a far more dangerous game. They explored the possibility of utilizing Ward as a back channel, hoping to use his influence to compromise or perhaps even recruit Ivanov as a double agent. This institutional calculation reveals that Ward was not simply a naive pawn being manipulated by the Soviets. His unique social access made him a highly valuable, albeit volatile, asset to both sides of the Cold War divide. The intelligence agencies attempted to weaponize the very social network that would soon bring down their own government. The distinct threads of this political tragedy finally converged during a sweltering weekend in July 1961 at Cliveden. This magnificent Buckinghamshire estate, owned by William Waldorf Astor, the third Viscount Astor, was a monument to aristocratic power and wealth. Cliveden had long been a gathering place for the British political elite, a location where policy was discussed over drinks and alliances were forged away from the prying eyes of the press. For this particular weekend, Stephen Ward had rented Spring Cottage, a small property on the estate grounds situated near the River Thames. Ward frequently used this cottage to entertain his eclectic mix of friends, bringing the bohemian energy of London nightlife directly into the heart of the conservative establishment. On a warm Saturday evening, the rigid boundaries of class and propriety dissolved around the Cliveden swimming pool. John Profumo, taking a break from his ministerial duties, wandered down to the pool area with Lord Astor. There, they encountered Ward and his guests. Among them was Christine Keeler, who had been swimming without a swimsuit. She scrambled out of the water, wrapping herself in a small towel. In that brief, informal encounter, the Secretary of State for War locked eyes with the teenage showgirl. This fleeting moment is historically recognized as the definitive flashpoint of the entire scandal. It was a scene stripped of institutional protocol, a situation where the immense power of a cabinet minister meant nothing against the raw, disruptive gravity of physical attraction. The imbalance between them was absolute. Keeler was remarkably young, socially unmoored, and financially dependent on the chaotic patronage of Stephen Ward. Profumo was decades her senior, married to a prominent actress, and held one of the most sensitive positions in the government of the United Kingdom. It is crucial to recognize that this unprecedented national security breach did not originate in a classified military installation or through a covert dead drop in a dark alley. It began in the relaxed, socially fluid environment of an aristocratic country estate. It happened in a space where politicians, diplomats, and young women from the fringes of society interacted far beyond the reach of institutional oversight or basic common sense. Following that weekend at Cliveden, Profumo and Keeler commenced a brief but intense physical relationship. Profumo pursued her actively, writing her letters, calling her, and arranging meetings in London. For a man of his standing, accustomed to getting what he wanted without facing resistance or consequences, the affair was likely viewed as a temporary, manageable indulgence. He was a product of a political culture that tacitly accepted the private indiscretions of its powerful men, provided they maintained strict public respectability. However, the inherent danger of this specific affair had absolutely nothing to do with marital infidelity or conventional morality. The catastrophic risk lay entirely in the specific geometry of the social network Stephen Ward had constructed. John Profumo controlled top-secret military intelligence, including the deployment of nuclear weapons and the strategic posture of the British Army. Christine Keeler, at the exact same time she was seeing Profumo, maintained a concurrent social and potentially physical relationship with Yevgeny Ivanov. Ivanov reported directly to Soviet military intelligence. Stephen Ward stood at the dead center of this web, orchestrating the movements of all three individuals, delighting in the dangerous proximity of state secrets and social transgression. There is no credible historical evidence to suggest that Keeler was deliberately deployed by the Soviet Union as a honeypot to ensnare the war minister. The narrative of a masterfully planned espionage operation makes for compelling fiction, but the reality was far more chaotic and deeply human. There is equally no evidence that Profumo ever intentionally or accidentally handed classified documents to Keeler during their encounters. He did not arrive at their meetings carrying briefcases full of state secrets. The true threat to the nation was not the direct transfer of paper. The true threat was the generation of absolute leverage. In the high-stakes realm of Cold War espionage, a secret does not need to contain military blueprints to be incredibly valuable. A secret capable of destroying the career, marriage, and social standing of a senior cabinet minister is a devastating weapon in itself. The danger was multi-layered. Could Keeler have inadvertently overheard sensitive information about troop movements or political strategies through casual pillow talk? Could Profumo be brutally blackmailed if the Soviets obtained concrete proof of the affair? Could Ivanov exploit this overlapping social network to apply psychological or political pressure on the British government? If the Soviet intelligence apparatus had acquired photographs or letters proving the Secretary of State for War was sharing a bed with a teenage girl intimately connected to a Soviet spy, Profumo would have been entirely at their mercy. They could have demanded intelligence, policy shifts, or sabotage in exchange for their silence. By engaging with Keeler, Profumo walked into an extortion trap. His absolute privilege had convinced him he was untouchable. He was entirely wrong. He had handed the enemies of his nation the exact tool required to destroy him. The British security apparatus did not remain entirely blind to this developing disaster. MI5 had been monitoring Yevgeny Ivanov long before the public or the press learned anything about the scandal. They understood perfectly well that he was an intelligence officer actively seeking to subvert British interests. Consequently, any British citizen associating closely with Ivanov immediately became a subject of high-priority surveillance. Stephen Ward, due to his frequent meetings and deep friendship with the Soviet attaché, fell firmly into this category, dragging anyone in his immediate orbit into the intelligence net. When the name of the Secretary of State for War suddenly surfaced within this monitored network, The situation escalated instantly from a routine counter-espionage operation to a cabinet-level constitutional crisis. The intelligence services realized that one of the most senior figures in the defense establishment was socially entwined with a known hostile agent through a young woman. The Director General of MI5 recognized the profound danger, not just to Profumo personally, but to the integrity of the Macmillan government and the vital security alliance with the United States. Profumo now faced two distinct and equally terrifying avenues of destruction. First was the political and domestic fallout. If the affair became public knowledge, his political career would instantly evaporate, and his marriage would be humiliated on a national stage. Second was the intelligence threat. If the Soviets realized the specific leverage they possessed, they could dismantle his life in secret. Recognizing the immense, immediate danger, the cabinet secretary requested a private meeting with Profumo. He delivered a formal, chilling warning about the severe security risks associated with the social circles of Stephen Ward and Yevgeny Ivanov. The warning struck Profumo with the force of a physical blow. The reality of his recklessness finally pierced the thick bubble of his privilege. Shortly after this high-level briefing, Profumo abruptly and permanently terminated his relationship with Christine Keeler. He sent her a brief, carefully worded letter ending their association, a document that would later become a critical piece of evidence against him. He stepped away from the abyss, hoping that his swift retreat would be enough to contain the damage and erase the risk entirely. At that specific moment in the late summer of 1961, Profumo likely believed the crisis had been successfully averted. The affair had ended. There were no police investigations, no arrests, and no missing classified documents. The press remained completely silent, respecting the traditional boundaries that protected men of his stature. Profumo relied heavily on the ingrained assumption that his indiscretion was too brief to matter, that Keeler lacked the power, credibility, or desire to challenge him, and that the British establishment would instinctively close ranks to protect one of its own. He believed the machinery of class and power would bury his mistake forever. He was entirely wrong. For Christine Keeler, the abrupt end of the relationship was simply another unpredictable shift in a life defined by instability. She did not fully comprehend the massive geopolitical forces swirling around her. To her, Profumo was just another wealthy, older man who had entered her life briefly and then vanished when the situation became complicated. She continued to live with Stephen Ward, continued to navigate the dangerous, glamorous underworld of London, entirely unaware that she was carrying a secret with the explosive potential to bring down the government. She remained vulnerable, lacking any real agency or protection in a society that viewed women like her as disposable commodities. Stephen Ward, however, was acutely aware of the dangerous game being played, yet he severely overestimated his ability to control it. He reveled in the knowledge that he held the secrets of the war minister and a Soviet spy. His arrogance blinded him to his own extreme vulnerability. He believed his powerful friends in the aristocracy and the government would always protect him because he was useful to them. He failed to understand the ruthless pragmatism of the British ruling class. When threatened, the establishment would not hesitate to sacrifice the middleman to ensure their own survival. Ward continued to host his parties, introduce young women to powerful men, and court danger, completely oblivious to the fact that MI5 was documenting his every move. Throughout 1962, a heavy, silent tension settled over the situation. Profumo threw himself back into his work, attempting to focus on the rising pressures of the Cold War and his duties as a cabinet minister. He attended Parliament, gave speeches on defense policy, and stood beside his wife at public events, playing the role of the devoted public servant flawlessly. Beneath the surface, however, the architecture of his life was incredibly fragile. The secret existed in the minds of too many unpredictable people. It existed in Ward files, in MI5 dossiers, and in the memory of a young woman who was becoming increasingly entangled in the violent fringes of the London underworld. The establishment shield holding the story back was strong, but it was not unbreakable. It only required a single chaotic spark to ignite the entire structure. For over a year, the secret remained buried beneath the surface of London society. The participants moved on with their lives, seemingly escaping the gravitational pull of their brief, disastrous intersection. The illusion of safety was about to be shattered, not by a KGB defector or a rigorous parliamentary investigation, but by the unpredictable violence of a spurned lover in a dark London alleyway. The secret might have remained buried in the files of British intelligence and the memories of a few reckless individuals, if not for an incident of domestic violence entirely disconnected from high politics. The catalyst for the greatest political crisis of the 20th century in Britain was not a sophisticated espionage operation, nor was it a rigorous parliamentary investigation. It was a chaotic dispute involving a gun in a quiet London alleyway. In December 1962, the fragile architecture of silence collapsed when a man named Johnny Edgecombe fired multiple shots at the door of a flat in Wimpole Mews. Edgecombe was a jazz promoter and a peripheral figure in the London underworld who had been involved in a volatile relationship with Christine Keeler. Their association had deteriorated into threats and physical altercations. Seeking refuge, Keeler had gone to the residence of Stephen Ward. Edgecombe tracked her down, demanding she come outside. When she refused, he drew a firearm and shot at the lock of the door. The gunfire shattered the afternoon quiet of the exclusive Marylebone neighborhood. Neighbors panicked, the police were immediately summoned, and Edgecombe was arrested. In a standard criminal environment, this would have been a routine case of attempted assault and illegal possession of a firearm. However, the arrest of Johnny Edgecombe set off a chain reaction that reached the highest levels of the British state. Because Edgecombe faced severe criminal charges, Christine Keeler was required to serve as the primary witness for the prosecution. She was no longer just an anonymous face in the Soho cabaret scene. She was now deeply embedded in the judicial system. The police began to interview her, documenting her associates, her living arrangements, and her sources of income. As the police dug into Keeler, the press inevitably followed. Crime reporters covering the Edgecombe case noticed that the young woman at the center of the dispute lived a life that did not align with her background. She had no steady, legitimate income, yet she resided in an expensive neighborhood associated with an elite society doctor and possessed a remarkably high-level address book. Fleet Street journalists, always hungry for a scandal involving the upper class, began to quietly investigate the circles surrounding Stephen Ward. What the reporters discovered was explosive. Through a combination of underworld gossip and relentless digging, they learned that this young showgirl had not only been associated with a known Soviet diplomat, Yevgeny Ivanov, but also had a brief romantic entanglement with the Secretary of State for War, John Profumo. The press had stumbled upon the ultimate story: sex, class, and the threat of Soviet espionage intersecting in the bedroom of a cabinet minister. Yet the British public remained entirely unaware. A wall of strict libel laws paralyzed the newspapers. In the 1960s, publishing allegations of sexual impropriety and security breaches against a senior government minister without ironclad physical proof guaranteed a ruinous lawsuit. Profumo was wealthy, powerful, and backed by the formidable legal machinery of the British establishment. Any newspaper that printed his name alongside Keeler and Ivanov without a confession or a conviction would be driven into bankruptcy. The editors of Fleet Street knew the truth, but they were legally gagged, forced to wait for a fracture in the system. That fracture began to form in early 1963. Keeler, feeling abandoned by Ward and terrified of Edgecombe, decided to monetize her story. She approached several newspapers, offering to sell the details of her affairs. She provided letters written to her by Profumo, written on official War Office stationery. The letters themselves were not explicitly compromising, merely affectionate, but they proved a definitive link between the minister and the model. Still, the newspapers hesitated. They bought the rights to her story, but refused to publish, deciding instead to hold the information as leverage while they waited for the political establishment to make a mistake. The situation became untenable when Keeler failed to appear as a witness at the trial of Johnny Edgecombe in March 1963. She had fled to Spain, likely to avoid the intense pressure from the police, the press, and the criminal elements connected to Edgecombe. Her disappearance caused an immediate media frenzy. Newspapers splashed her face across their front pages, explicitly mentioning her connection to Stephen Ward and hinting heavily at her associations with unnamed figures in the highest levels of government. They could not name Profumo directly, but they provided enough breadcrumbs for the political class to realize the story was about to detonate. Inside the House of Commons, the atmosphere grew toxic. Opposition members of Parliament, particularly those in the Labour Party, were receiving the exact same rumors as the journalists. George Whig, a Labour MP with a deep interest in military and security affairs, recognized the profound danger. Whig cared very little about Profumo private morality, but he deeply about the implication that the war minister shared a social network with a Soviet spy. Whig understood that the press was silenced by libel laws, so he deployed the one weapon that could bypass those laws: parliamentary privilege. Under the rules of the British system, any statement made by a member of Parliament on the floor of the House of Commons is absolutely protected from libel litigation. Furthermore, the press is legally permitted to report on anything said during parliamentary debates. On the night of March 21, 1963, Whig stood in the chamber and deliberately brought the rumors into the official record. He stated that there were widespread rumors involving a member of the government, rumors that were paralyzing the press and threatening national security. He demanded that the government address these allegations directly and clear the name of the minister involved. The trap was sprung. Once Whig spoke, the protective seal was broken. The following morning, every major newspaper in Britain reported Whig comments. The story was no longer restricted to private clubs and newsroom floors. It was a matter of national debate. Profumo could no longer hide behind the silence of the establishment. Prime Minister Harold Macmillan and the senior Conservative leadership realized they had to act immediately to kill the rumors before they destroyed the credibility of the government. In the early hours of March 22, Profumo was summoned to a meeting with senior cabinet colleagues and government lawyers. They subjected him to an intense interrogation regarding his relationship with Keeler. Profumo, realizing his career was moments away from total collapse, made a catastrophic decision. He doubled down on his innocence. He looked his colleagues in the eye and categorically denied any sexual relationship with the young woman. He claimed their association was entirely innocent and fleeting, and he vehemently denied any security breach involving Ivanov. The ministers interrogating Profumo faced a critical choice. They could push harder, demand a full police investigation, and potentially uncover a truth that would humiliate their party. Or they could accept the word of a fellow gentleman, a man of their own class and background. The British class system dictated their response. They possessed an overwhelming, almost fatalistic bias toward believing the powerful man over the marginalized woman. They accepted Profumo denial because it reinforced their worldview that men of their standing did not behave in such a reckless manner. They helped him draft a formal statement of denial to be read to the House of Commons that very morning. On March 22, 1963, John Profumo walked into the packed chamber of the House of Commons. The atmosphere was incredibly tense. He stood at the dispatch box, the center of British political power, and delivered a personal statement. He explicitly stated that there was no impropriety whatsoever in his acquaintanceship with Miss Keeler. He declared that he had not seen her since December 1961. He concluded by stating that he would not hesitate to issue writs for libel and slander against anyone who repeated the rumors outside the House. His statement was greeted with cheers of support from his conservative colleagues. Prime Minister Harold Macmillan stood firmly beside him, signaling the absolute backing of the government. On the surface, it appeared to be a total victory. Profumo had stared down his accusers, threatened the press into submission, and asserted the invincible authority of his office. The establishment had closed ranks, protecting one of its own with the full weight of parliamentary tradition. But the victory was a fragile illusion built on a foundation of absolute deceit. Before that morning, Profumo was guilty of a reckless affair and terrible judgment. After that morning, he had committed a cardinal sin against the British democratic system. A minister is strictly obligated to provide truthful information to Parliament. Willfully misleading the House elevates a personal moral failure to a profound breach of constitutional duty. By lying, Profumo forced the entire government, including the Prime Minister, to stake its credibility on his falsehood. He had turned a private scandal into a ticking time bomb placed directly beneath the government. The truth was out there, held by journalists, police officers, and a young woman in Spain, and no amount of aristocratic arrogance could keep it buried forever. The immediate aftermath of the statement delivered on March 22 felt like a resounding triumph for the conservative establishment. John Profumo returned to his ministerial duties at the War Office, projecting the calm and unbothered demeanor expected of a man who had successfully defended his honor. The threat of severe libel action hung heavily over Fleet Street, effectively gagging the newspapers. For a brief window of time, the British ruling class believed they had successfully contained the crisis, proving once again that their authority was absolute and their ranks were impenetrable. However, the silence was entirely artificial. Beneath the surface, the machinery of the state and the relentless curiosity of the press were moving with increasing speed. While the politicians desperately wanted the story to disappear, the police forces of Scotland Yard, specifically the Vice Squad, were intensifying their focus on Stephen Ward. The establishment instinctively understood that a scandal of this magnitude required a scapegoat. The anger and the intense scrutiny generated by the rumors had to be directed away from the government and channeled toward a suitable target. Ward, the social connector who brought the underworld to the doorsteps of the aristocracy, was the perfect candidate. The police began a systematic and aggressive investigation into Ward and his finances. They were looking for any evidence to support a charge of living off the immoral earnings of prostitution. Detectives interviewed dozens of people who had attended his parties, focusing heavily on Christine Keeler and her friend Mandy Rice Davies. The investigators applied immense pressure to these young women, interrogating them about their living arrangements, the money they received from wealthy men, and the precise nature of their relationship with the society doctor. The state was actively weaponizing its judicial power against the middleman, attempting to construct a criminal case that would cleanly separate the respectable politicians from the sordid realities of the London nightlife. As the police closed in, Stephen Ward experienced the brutal pragmatism of the British upper class. The wealthy and powerful men who had happily drank his liquor, attended his gatherings, and utilized his unique social connections suddenly vanished. His aristocratic friends stopped returning his phone calls. His elite medical patients quietly sought treatment elsewhere. He was systematically isolated, cut off from the network he had spent years meticulously building. Ward had mistakenly believed that his proximity to power made him immune to consequences. He failed to realize that he was only tolerated as long as he was useful and discreet. The moment he became a liability, the establishment abandoned him without a second thought. While the police pursued Ward, the press engaged in a highly sophisticated game of cat and mouse with the libel laws. The newspapers could not print the name of the war minister alongside allegations of a security breach, but they found other ways to keep the narrative alive and in the public eye. They published extensive serialized interviews with Christine Keeler, detailing her life story, her difficult childhood, and her rise in the London cabaret scene. These articles were carefully sanitized to avoid direct legal threats, but they were filled with heavy implications. The public, becoming increasingly adept at reading between the lines, understood exactly what the newspapers were hinting at. The tension in London became suffocating. The psychological burden on John Profumo during these weeks was immense. Every single day he walked into the House of Commons or the War Office, he carried the agonizing knowledge that he was an imposter. He had looked his closest colleagues, his prime minister, and his country in the eye and delivered a calculated falsehood. The isolation of maintaining a lie of that magnitude began to severely degrade his resolve. His wife, Valerie Hobson, remained fiercely loyal, accompanying him to charity galas and political dinners, projecting an image of absolute marital solidarity. Her unwavering trust made his internal reality even more difficult to bear. He knew he was forcing her to unknowingly participate in a massive public deception. By late May, the political shield surrounding Profumo began to disintegrate completely. The whisper campaigns in Westminster grew so loud that the government could no longer ignore them. Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, realizing the issue was severely damaging the credibility of his administration, reluctantly tasked the Lord Chancellor to conduct a private high-level inquiry into the security aspects of the rumors. For Profumo, this was the definitive breaking point. He understood the ruthless efficiency of a formal government inquiry. He knew the police possessed witness statements detailing his visits to Stephen Ward. He knew the press held affectionate letters he had written on official War Office stationery. He realized with absolute clarity that the investigators would inevitably uncover the truth, and his lie would be exposed not by his own admission, but by the relentless digging of his colleagues. The walls were closing in, and the escape routes were entirely gone. During the parliamentary recess in early June, Profumo and his wife took a brief holiday to Venice. The trip was intended as a respite from the immense pressure of London, but it served only to clarify the inevitability of his downfall. It was there, walking through the quiet streets of the Italian city, far removed from the suffocating atmosphere of Westminster, that the burden finally broke him. He could no longer sustain the deception. In a moment of devastating honesty, he confessed the entire truth to Valerie Hobson. He admitted to the affair with Keeler, and more importantly, he admitted to the colossal lie he had delivered to Parliament. Upon returning to London, the situation moved with brutal speed. On June 4, Profumo sought an urgent meeting with his political superiors. He formally admitted his deception to the government. He drafted a letter of resignation addressed directly to the Prime Minister, acknowledging his severe breach of parliamentary privilege and expressing his deep, unreserved regret for the damage he had caused to his family, his party, and his country. He resigned from his cabinet position and surrendered his seat in the House of Commons, effectively ending his political life in a matter of hours. The political explosion that followed was unprecedented in modern British history. Harold Macmillan was on holiday in Scotland when he received the news of the resignation. The Prime Minister was reportedly shattered. Macmillan was a man of an older generation, an Edwardian gentleman who had fought in the brutal trenches of the First World War. To him, the concept of honor and an officer's word was an unbreakable, sacred bond. The fact that a fellow officer, a man of his exact social background and education, had looked him in the eye and lied to him personally represented a moral decay he simply could not process. Macmillan felt entirely betrayed, not just by a political colleague, but by his own class. The government was left looking incredibly foolish, naive, and incompetent. They had placed the full weight of their institutional authority behind a man who had deceived them effortlessly. The opposition parties seized on the moment, demanding to know how the security apparatus and the Prime Minister could have been so easily blinded. The public reaction was even more severe. The deference that the working and middle classes had traditionally shown to the elite evaporated overnight. The hypocrisy of the ruling class was laid bare for the entire world to see, proving that the men who demanded moral rectitude from the nation were utterly incapable of holding themselves to the same standard. The resignation of John Profumo on the 5th of June unleashed an unprecedented media storm across the United Kingdom and the world. For months, Fleet Street had been forced to operate in the shadows, paralyzed by the severe British libel laws and the aggressive threats of a powerful cabinet minister. With Profumo's formal admission of deceit, the legal dam completely broke. Newspapers abandoned all previous restraint, dedicating page after page to the scandal. The story of the war minister, the showgirl, and the Soviet spy dominated the front pages of every major publication. The British public, long accustomed to a deferential and highly controlled press, was suddenly subjected to a daily barrage of sensational details regarding the private lives of their political leaders. The shockwave moving through the public was not simply about a sexual affair. The public reaction was rooted in a profound sense of institutional betrayal. The establishment had always justified its monopoly on power by claiming a superior moral and intellectual standing. They were educated at elite institutions, raised in aristocratic traditions, and presumed to possess an innate sense of duty that ordinary citizens lacked. The revelation that a senior minister had engaged in a reckless liaison with a woman intimately connected to a hostile foreign intelligence agent and had then utilized the solemn platform of the House of Commons to lie about it shattered that foundational myth. The ruling class was exposed as deeply flawed, arrogant, and entirely capable of compromising national security for the sake of personal convenience. Within the halls of Westminster, the Conservative government was fighting for its political survival. Prime Minister Harold Macmillan faced a devastating crisis of leadership. He had personally backed Profumo, accepted his word as an officer and a gentleman, and authorized the misleading statement to Parliament. Now Macmillan appeared either dangerously incompetent or willfully blind. The opposition Labour Party, led by the sharp and highly strategic Harold Wilson, recognized a fatal weakness. Wilson carefully avoided attacking Profumo on moral grounds, understanding that focusing on personal vice could generate public sympathy for a ruined man. Instead, Wilson focused the entire attack on the catastrophic failure of the state security apparatus. On the 17th of June, the House of Commons held a highly anticipated debate regarding the resignation. The atmosphere in the chamber was electric, packed with members of Parliament and journalists waiting to see if the government would fall. Harold Macmillan stood at the dispatch box, looking visibly aged and deeply exhausted by the relentless pressure. He delivered a defensive and almost mournful speech. He explained to the House that he had been deceived, arguing that he had acted in good faith based on the assertions of a trusted colleague. He pleaded that it was impossible for a prime minister to constantly monitor the private lives of his ministers without establishing a secret police force, which would be entirely alien to British democratic traditions. His defense, while emotionally resonant to some of his older colleagues, was politically disastrous. By claiming he had been easily fooled, Macmillan inadvertently confirmed the exact narrative the opposition was building. He painted a picture of a government that was entirely out of touch, operating on outdated codes of aristocratic honor, while the harsh realities of Cold War espionage systematically bypassed them. Harold Wilson delivered a surgical dismantling of the government defense. He pointed out the catastrophic lack of communication between the intelligence services, the police, and the office of the Prime Minister. Wilson demanded to know why MI5, knowing the extreme risks associated with Yevgeny Ivanov and Stephen Ward, had not bypassed standard protocols to warn the Prime Minister directly the moment the War Minister name appeared in their surveillance reports. The debate highlighted a terrifying structural flaw in the British state. The various agencies responsible for national security were operating in heavily siloed environments, crippled by class deference, and an overwhelming desire to avoid embarrassing the political elite. The security of the nation had been compromised not by a brilliant Soviet masterstroke, but by the polite, institutional silence of the British establishment. While the politicians fought over the surviving wreckage of the government, the criminal justice system accelerated its ruthless pursuit of Stephen Ward. To divert public fury away from Westminster, the state aggressively weaponized the vice squad against the one man who lacked institutional protection. Without the armor of wealth or inherited title, Ward was swiftly isolated, arrested, and prosecuted under the Sexual Offences Act. Ward was arrested and charged with severe violations of the Sexual Offences Act. The specific charges accused him of living off the immoral earnings of prostitution, primarily relating to his associations with Christine Keeler and her close friend Mandy Rice Davies. The police vice squad threw immense resources into building the case. Detectives scoured London, interviewing anyone who had ever attended a party hosted by Ward. They utilized aggressive interrogation tactics, applying severe pressure to vulnerable young women, threatening them with their own legal consequences if they did not provide testimony that painted Ward as a calculating pimp. The prosecution strategy was a masterpiece of legal manipulation. They did not need to prove that Ward was a conventional pimp running a highly organized criminal enterprise. Under the broad interpretations of the law at the time, they merely needed to demonstrate that he had provided accommodation to women who were receiving money or gifts from other men, and that he derived some vague lifestyle benefit from this arrangement. Ward had indeed allowed Keeler and Rice Davies to live in his flat, and they had certainly received money from the wealthy men they met through his social network. However, Ward was a highly successful osteopath with a substantial legitimate income. The idea that he required the irregular earnings of teenage showgirls to survive was fundamentally absurd, yet the state pursued the narrative with absolute determination. As Ward sat in a cell at Brixton Prison, initially denied bail, the brutal reality of his situation became agonizingly clear. He attempted to contact his powerful friends, the aristocrats, politicians, and diplomats, who had spent years enjoying his hospitality and utilizing his connections. He wrote letters begging for character references and financial support for his legal defense. The response was complete and terrifying silence. The British establishment executed a flawless collective abandonment. Men who had trusted him with their most damaging secrets completely erased him from their memories. The doors of high society slammed shut, leaving Ward entirely isolated against the full crushing weight of the judicial system. The trial of Stephen Ward commenced at the Old Bailey, the Central Criminal Court of England, in the summer of 1963. The proceedings immediately took on the atmosphere of a chaotic circus. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse daily, desperate for a glimpse of Keeler, Rice Davies, and the various figures of the London underworld who were called to testify. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution presented a highly sanitized version of events, carefully avoiding any detailed mention of the prominent political figures who had frequented Ward's social circles. The state was heavily invested in securing a conviction against Ward while simultaneously protecting the anonymity of the wider establishment. The cross-examinations were brutal. The prosecution attacked Ward's character, framing his bohemian lifestyle, his interest in young women, and his unorthodox social habits as definitive proof of deep criminality. They relied heavily on the testimonies of Keeler and Rice Davies, whose statements frequently contradicted each other and changed under pressure. Keeler, highly stressed and facing her own complex legal issues, offered testimony that heavily supported the prosecution narrative, distancing herself from Ward to ensure her own survival. It was during this trial that Mandy Rice Davies delivered a piece of testimony that would permanently define the cultural memory of the scandal. She stood in the witness box, facing hostile questioning from the prosecuting counsel. The lawyer aggressively challenged her credibility, pointing out that William Waldorf Astor, the immensely powerful Viscount Astor, had issued a categorical denial regarding her claims that she had engaged in a physical relationship with him. The lawyer expected the young woman to wither under the invoked authority of a British aristocrat. Instead, Rice Davies remained entirely unfazed. She responded simply, "Well, he would, wouldn't he?" That brief, profoundly cynical response echoed across the entire nation. It perfectly articulated the total collapse of deference. A 19-year-old showgirl stood in the most imposing criminal court in the country and openly mocked the presumed honesty of the ruling class. She verbalized what the entire working class already understood: that men of wealth and immense power instinctively lie to protect their privileges, and that the grand, solemn denials of the aristocracy were nothing more than a defensive tactic. It was a moment of absolute clarity that completely dismantled the illusion of moral superiority the establishment had relied upon for centuries. Despite the obvious flaws in the prosecution case and the highly questionable nature of the witness testimonies, the machinery of the court was clearly moving toward a predetermined outcome. The judge presiding over the case delivered a summing up to the jury that was widely criticized by legal observers as heavily biased against the defendant. He consistently minimized the points made by the defense and amplified the most damaging aspects of the prosecution narrative. He subtly instructed the jury to view Ward through the lens of moral disgust rather than strict legal evidence. Stephen Ward listened to the judge's summary with growing despair. He possessed a deep intelligence and a cynical understanding of how power operated in Britain. He looked around the courtroom, recognizing that the legal process was merely a formality. The state had decided that he was the necessary sacrifice required to cleanse the nation of the Profumo taint. He was not being tried for his specific actions. He was being tried for the collective embarrassment of the ruling class. He realized with absolute certainty that he was going entirely alone into the abyss. On the evening of July 30, Stephen Ward left the courtroom facing the absolute certainty of his conviction. The judge presiding over his trial had delivered a summing up that made a guilty verdict inevitable, systematically dismantling the arguments of the defense while amplifying the most damaging assertions of the prosecution. Returning to a friend flat in Chelsea, Ward engaged in the meticulous preparations of a man who had made a definitive decision to end his own life. He spent his final hours writing a series of letters addressed to friends, journalists, and his legal team. In these final messages, he expressed a profound bitterness toward the establishment that had eagerly utilized his social connections and then violently discarded him when those connections became a political liability. He maintained his absolute innocence regarding the specific charges of living off immoral earnings, insisting until the end that the judicial system was being weaponized as an instrument of political revenge and state self-preservation. Sometime during the deep hours of the night, Ward consumed a massive, fatal dose of Nimbutal sleeping pills. He was discovered the following morning, completely unresponsive, and rushed to St. Stephen Hospital. As a team of medical professionals fought a losing battle to revive him, the legal machinery at the Old Bailey refused to halt its momentum. In a display of judicial ruthlessness that shocked many contemporary legal observers, the judge ordered the trial to proceed to its conclusion despite the absence of the primary defendant. The jury, deliberating while Ward lay in an irreversible coma, returned a verdict of guilty on the charges of living off the earnings of Christine Keeler and Mandy Rice Davies. It was a hollow procedural victory for the state. The prosecution had secured their required conviction, but the target was already beyond the reach of their punishment. 3 days later, on August 3, 1963, Stephen Ward died without ever regaining consciousness. The death of the osteopath generated a complex and cynical wave of reactions across the upper echelons of London society. Among the political elite and the aristocracy, there was a quiet, undeniable sense of profound relief. Ward was the only individual who possessed the full, unvarnished truth about the intersecting networks of the British upper class, the criminal underworld, and foreign intelligence. He knew exactly which lords attended his illicit gatherings, which politicians utilized his services, and the true extent of his complex relationship with MI5. With his death, the most dangerous and unpredictable element of the Profumo scandal was permanently neutralized. He took the darkest secrets of the British establishment with him to the grave, ensuring that the full extent of the systemic hypocrisy would never face a formal courtroom examination. Inevitably, the incredibly convenient timing of his suicide birthed numerous conspiracy theories that persist in historical debates. Speculation ran rampant among the public and the press that Ward had been directly murdered by British intelligence agents to prevent him from exposing further high-level corruption or detailing his own work as a domestic informant. While modern historians generally dismiss the idea of a direct state-sponsored assassination, preferring the heavily documented explanation of a desperate suicide driven by the absolute certainty of public ruin and imprisonment, the outcome undeniably served the state perfectly. The establishment did not need to deploy operatives to murder Stephen Ward. They simply needed to subject him to a level of concentrated judicial and social pressure that made his continued existence unbearable. However, the death of Ward did not close the political wound or stabilize the government. The British public remained deeply suspicious, convinced that the Macmillan administration was still actively hiding the true extent of the security breach. The opposition Labour Party continued to hammer the Prime Minister in Parliament, demanding a full accounting of how a suspected Soviet military intelligence officer had been allowed to operate in the immediate vicinity of the Secretary of State for War, without triggering immediate alarms at the highest levels of government. Recognizing that the survival of his administration depended entirely on restoring some measure of public trust, Harold Macmillan commissioned an unprecedented official inquiry. He appointed Lord Denning, the Master of the Rolls and one of the most respected senior judges in the country, to conduct a comprehensive investigation into the security implications of the entire affair. Denning was granted sweeping, extraordinary powers to demand documents and interview cabinet ministers, intelligence officers, senior police officials, and the various civilians connected to the Ward network. The Denning inquiry was a highly unusual operation by the standards of British law. Denning operated with immense speed and extreme secrecy. He summoned witnesses to his private offices, interviewing them personally without the presence of legal counsel or the rigor of formal cross-examination. This streamlined format allowed him to gather information quickly and bypass bureaucratic delays, but it also meant the evidence was never subjected to strict legal testing. Denning interviewed everyone from the Prime Minister to Christine Keeler, attempting to construct a definitive timeline of the scandal and accurately assess the actual damage to the defense capabilities of the nation. In September 1963, the Denning report was finally released to the public. The publication instantly became a defining cultural event of the decade. The government chose to release the document at midnight, leading to extraordinary scenes in central London. Thousands of ordinary citizens queued outside the government stationery office in the middle of the night, desperate to purchase a copy. It sold over 100,000 copies in the first 24 hours, becoming one of the best-selling government documents in British history. The massive public appetite was driven by a complex mix of genuine political concern and sheer voyeurism. The Denning Report was a bizarre historical document. It was a formal government inquiry regarding national security that read like a scandalous serialized novel, detailing the sexual habits of senior ministers, the exclusive parties of the aristocracy, and the clandestine movements of Soviet spies. Denning ultimately concluded that while Profumo behavior was severely improper and represented a massive failure of personal judgment, there was no credible evidence to suggest that any classified military information had actually been passed to Yevgeny Ivanov or the Soviet Union. The official verdict delivered to the public was that national security had not been breached. The report, however, delivered a scathing critique of the government handling of the crisis. Denning criticized the catastrophic lack of communication between the security services, the police, and the Prime Minister. He explicitly noted that the political leadership had been dangerously slow to recognize the threat, crippled by an institutional reluctance to confront a fellow gentleman. Yet, for all its structural criticisms of the government machinery, the Denning Report ultimately served to protect the broader establishment. Denning directed the vast majority of his moral outrage and harsh language at Stephen Ward and Christine Keeler, framing them as the corrupting external influences that had temporarily derailed a fundamentally sound political system. Many contemporary political observers and later historians viewed the Denning Report as a highly sophisticated exercise in damage control. By focusing heavily on the lurid details of Ward parties and Keeler lifestyle, Denning managed to distract the public from the deeper, systemic failures of the British state. The report functioned to reassure the nation that the establishment was still essentially honorable, despite the tragic personal failings of one specific minister. It concluded that the security services had acted correctly within their limited mandates. The police had performed their duties, and the government had simply been the unfortunate victim of an unprecedented deception by a trusted insider. The public reaction to the Denning Report was deeply fractured along class lines. For those loyal to the traditional institutions of power, the document provided a necessary closure. It allowed them to believe that the rot was isolated, effectively amputated with the resignation of Profumo and the death of Ward. The Conservative Party apparatus immediately seized upon the conclusion that no state secrets had been compromised, utilizing it to fiercely defend their continued right to govern. They argued that while severe mistakes in personnel management had occurred, the fundamental safety of the nation and its nuclear deterrent had never been truly jeopardized. However, a large and increasingly vocal segment of the population completely rejected the neat, sanitized conclusions presented by Lord Denning. The rapid societal shifts of the early 1960s had cultivated a demographic that was inherently suspicious of official government narratives. They saw the report for what it functionally was, a mechanism engineered by the ruling class to protect its own legitimacy. The working classes and the emerging youth culture clearly noted the glaring disparities in how the state treated the various participants in the scandal. The public observed that a cabinet minister who lied to Parliament was allowed to resign with his wealth, his pension, and his social connections entirely intact. A wealthy aristocrat who hosted the fateful gatherings on his country estate faced almost no public scrutiny or legal consequences. In stark contrast, the middle-class doctor who facilitated the network was driven to suicide under the crushing weight of a relentless state prosecution. And the young women from impoverished backgrounds who were utilized by all these powerful men were subjected to intense police intimidation and vicious media vilification. The Denning Report failed completely to address this profound imbalance of power and consequence. It treated the scandal as an isolated incident of moral failure and administrative miscommunication, entirely ignoring the systemic class protections that allowed the crisis to develop in the first place. This failure to acknowledge the harsh reality of the British class system only accelerated the decline of deference. The public realized that official inquiries conducted by senior members of the establishment would always, ultimately, serve the fundamental interests of the establishment. The truth, as presented by the state, was no longer accepted as absolute or objective. The sheer panic gripping the British state and the government's disproportionate force against figures like Ward was deeply rooted in the exact geopolitical timeline. The Profumo scandal unfolded in the immediate aftermath of the October 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. The world had just stood on the absolute brink of total nuclear annihilation. The confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union had definitively demonstrated that the margin for error in international intelligence was effectively zero. In this environment of supreme global paranoia, the discovery that the British Secretary of State for War was sharing a social circle and potentially a bed with a young woman connected to a suspected GRU officer was not just an embarrassment. It was viewed as a potential catalyst for a strategic disaster. The Americans, who shared deeply sensitive nuclear intelligence and defense strategies with their British allies, were watching the situation in London with extreme alarm. The Central Intelligence Agency and the Federal Bureau of Investigation demanded constant updates from MI5 regarding the true extent of the security breach. The British government was terrified that the scandal would cause the United States to reconsider or sever vital intelligence sharing agreements, completely isolating Britain on the Cold War stage. This intense international pressure explains the brutal speed and absolute lack of mercy directed at Stephen Ward. The Macmillan government had to demonstrate to Washington that they were fully capable of ruthlessly purging security threats from their system, regardless of the domestic fallout. Ward was sacrificed not merely to appease the anger of the British public, but to actively reassure the American intelligence apparatus that the British establishment was still capable of maintaining order and protecting shared secrets. The domestic criminal trial was, in many operational ways, a performative display of state power designed specifically for an international audience. Meanwhile, Yevgeny Ivanov had long since departed the United Kingdom. Sensing the impending collapse of the Ward network and the growing aggressive attention of MI5, Soviet intelligence recalled their naval attaché back to Moscow in January 1963, months before the scandal officially broke on the floor of Parliament. Ivanov returned safely to the Soviet Union, leaving a trail of absolute institutional destruction in his wake. His precise role, his specific orders from Moscow, and the exact level of intelligence he managed to gather during his time in London remain locked in the classified archives of Russian military intelligence. While Ivanov resumed his military career in the East, completely shielded from any consequences, the individuals he interacted with in the West were left to face the devastating fallout of their association. The asymmetrical nature of Cold War espionage meant that the professional operative escaped completely untouched, while the civilian targets and the intermediaries were systematically destroyed. The British establishment, entirely unable to punish the Soviet agent who had caused the crisis, directed the entirety of its institutional fury at its own citizens, preparing to deal with the surviving participants of the scandal. Following the Denning Report and Stephen Ward's death, the British establishment closed ranks, leaving the public to fixate entirely on Christine Keeler. The media rapidly commodified her, transforming a vulnerable young woman into a two-dimensional symbol of moral decay, a status cemented by Lewis Morley's iconic chair photograph. This intense focus deliberately obscured the severe power imbalance at the heart of the scandal. John Profumo, a highly educated cabinet minister approaching 50, made the conscious decisions to engage in a reckless liaison, ignore intelligence risks, and lie to the House of Commons. Keeler, barely 20 and lacking institutional protection, was instead utilized as a lightning rod to absorb the national outrage, while the political class quietly repaired its image. The aftermath exposed the rigid, unforgiving mechanics of the British class system. Shielded by immense inherited wealth, John Profumo retreated into charity work, eventually earning a CBE from the Queen and full reintegration into the elite. In stark contrast, Christine Keeler was aggressively targeted by the state, serving 9 months in prison for perjury in an unrelated case. She lived her final years in financial hardship, permanently frozen in the cultural consciousness as a tabloid archetype. The establishment eulogized the man who committed political treason, while the media reduced the woman to a single scandalous photograph. The Profumo Affair was the definitive catalyst that destroyed the old conservative order and rewired the British media landscape. It marked the permanent death of public deference. The electorate realized that the ruling class was driven by the same base desires and self-preservation instincts as the people they governed. Ultimately, the scandal proved a chilling reality. The British state possessed an infinite capacity to protect its core institutions by ruthlessly sacrificing the vulnerable individuals caught on its periphery.